The capture. Jake Carter opened his eyes. His head hurt, and everything around him was blurry. He tried to move, but his arms felt weak. The last thing he remembered was walking home late at night. Now he was lying on a cold, smooth floor. As his vision cleared, Jake's heart pounded. This was not his bedroom. This was not Earth. He was inside a golden cage. The bars were thick, glowing faintly with a strange blue light. The floor beneath him was metal, and the air smelled different, like flowers, and something unnatural, like electricity. Jake forced himself to sit up. Outside the cage, the room was huge, decorated with strange symbols on the walls. The ceiling was high, with golden chandeliers that floated in the air without any chains or wires. Everything looked too clean, too perfect, like something out of a futuristic movie. Then he heard footsteps. Jake turned his head quickly. Several tall figures walked into the room. His breath caught in his throat. They were not human. Their skin was dark purple, smooth like glass. Their eyes were bright silver, with no pupils. They wore armor made of black metal, with golden symbols glowing on their chests. Each of them had a long, sharp tail, moving behind them like a snake. One of them stepped closer to the cage and spoke in a strange, echoing voice. "The new pet is awake." Jake didn't move. He understood them. Somehow, their words made sense in his head. But he knew one thing. If they thought he was just an animal, then it was better to stay silent. Another figure entered the room, and Jake immediately knew she was important. She was taller than the others, standing with a graceful but powerful posture. Unlike the armored guards, she wore a flowing black and gold robe. Her silver eyes stared at Jake, like a scientist studying a new experiment. The guards bowed as she stepped forward. "Your Majesty," one of them said. "The creature has awakened." Jake's mind raced. "Your Majesty, was she some kind of queen?" The woman stopped in front of his cage, tilting her head slightly. Then she let out a small, amused laugh. "What a strange little thing," she said. "So soft, so weak-looking." Jake felt his fists clench, but he quickly relaxed. "Don't react. Don't let them know you understand." The Empress turned to her guards. "Where did you find this creature?" One of the guards bowed. "It was wandering alone on a small blue planet, Your Majesty. We thought it might amuse you." "A blue planet?" The Empress's eyes narrowed slightly. "Interesting. And it is not dangerous?" "No, Empress Axalvera. It is harmless. It cannot even speak properly." Jake almost scoffed. If only they knew. The Empress stepped closer, her tall figure towering over him. She reached out a hand, her long fingers brushing against Jake's hair. "Soft," she murmured. "Strange little thing. But fascinating." Jake forced himself to stay still. He could feel his heart beating fast, but he knew this was not the time to panic. If they saw him as a dumb animal, they wouldn't see him as a threat. That meant he had a chance to escape. The Empress straightened, a small smirk on her lips. "Prepare it for my chamber," she said. "I want to examine it more closely." Jake's stomach twisted. This was bad. The guards pressed something on the cage, and suddenly the glowing bars disappeared. Two of them grabbed Jake's arms roughly, pulling him to his feet. He didn't resist. He had to play along for now. As they dragged him down a long hallway, Jake saw something that made his blood turn cold. A row of other cages, just like his. Inside them were different creatures, strange, alien beings, each one looking miserable, scared, or dead. Jake swallowed hard. This wasn't just a palace. It was a prison. As the guards pushed him forward, he kept his face blank. But inside, his mind was racing. "I have to get out of here. And I need to do it fast." Learning their secrets. Jake Carter sat in the center of the Empress's grand chamber, pretending to be nothing more than a simple, dumb creature. His heart pounded, but he kept his face blank. Every movement, every breath had to be careful. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a pet, at least that's what they thought. The Empress, Queen Salvera, lounged on an enormous golden throne, watching him with an expression of mild amusement. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way. Her dark purple skin glowed under the soft golden light, and her silver eyes reflected intelligence, arrogance, and something else, curiosity. She lifted a delicate glass filled with a bright blue liquid and took a slow sip, never taking her eyes off him. "You are different." Her voice was smooth but carried undeniable authority. Jake didn't move. He kept his posture loose, his head slightly tilted, mimicking the confused animal. He had seen dogs do this back on Earth. If she truly thought he was a pet, he needed to act like one. The guard standing behind her chuckled. "It is slow, Empress," one of them said. "Simple. Its kind lacks intelligence." Jake clenched his fists but quickly forced himself to relax. He couldn't afford to react. Not yet. The Empress smirked. "Perhaps. But it is soft. Warm." She leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her fist. "Unlike the usual creatures they bring me. Those are always so dull. They either cry or attack. This one does neither. It is calm." Jake's skin crawled under her gaze. She wasn't looking at him like a person. She was looking at him the way a wealthy collector would admire a rare gemstone. A loud buzzing sound echoed in the room, and a large door slid open. A new figure entered, a tall, pale blue alien wearing a long black robe. He held a metallic device in his hands, and his eyes glowed with unreadable thoughts. "Your Majesty," the robed alien spoke, bowing deeply. "I have completed my scans of the creature. Would you like to hear the report?" Jake tensed. This was dangerous. If their scans were too advanced, they might have already figured out that he was far more intelligent than he let on. The Empress waved a hand lazily. "Go on, Drelv." Drelv nodded and pressed something on his device. A small holographic screen appeared above it, displaying strange symbols and charts. "This creature's biology is unique," Drelv said. "Its body is weaker than most creatures in the Empire. No natural weapons, no advanced muscle density, no venom or energy reserves." The guards laughed again. Jake gritted his teeth, keeping his face blank. Drelv continued, ignoring them. "However, it possesses an unusual brain structure, high neural activity, complex thought patterns. It is possible that this creature has an advanced form of problem-solving intelligence." A heavy silence filled the room. Jake's heart pounded. This was bad. The Empress's silver eyes flickered with new interest. "Are you saying it thinks?" Drelv hesitated. "It is difficult to say, Your Majesty. We have no way of truly measuring its understanding. If it has intelligence, it is well hidden." Jake exhaled silently. That was close. The Empress tilted her head, studying him once more. Then, to Jake's horror, she suddenly reached out a hand toward him. Jake froze. He had no choice but to let it happen. Her fingers brushed his cheek, then trailed lightly down his arm. Her touch was cool and smooth, yet terrifying. She was testing him, waiting to see if he would react in a way that proved his intelligence. Jake forced himself to stay perfectly still. After a few seconds, she pulled back, laughing softly. "Fascinating," she murmured. "If it is truly intelligent, it is hiding it well." The guards relaxed, the tension disappearing. But Jake knew he was on thin ice. If he made one mistake, they would figure out the truth. The Empress leaned back in her throne, her expression turning playful. "I think I will keep it. At least for now." Jake bit the inside of his cheek. Of course, she wasn't going to let him go. The Empress clapped her hands, and two tall armored guards stepped forward. "Take it to the royal chambers. Make sure it is fed and cleaned. I want it to be comfortable." Jake forced himself to go limp as the guards grabbed him. He kept his face blank, but inside, his mind was racing. This wasn't just a prison. This was an opportunity. The Empress saw him as nothing more than an exotic pet, but that meant he had access to places no prisoner ever would. He had to learn everything. As the guards dragged him out of the chamber, Jake glanced at the large screen on the far wall, displaying a holographic map of the Empire. Dozens of red symbols blinked in different locations. He had no idea what they meant yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just an empire. It was preparing for war. Jake lowered his gaze, hiding his smirk. They thought he was nothing. A pet. But soon, he would prove them wrong. Escape plan begins. Jake Carter sat in the royal chamber of Empress Calvera, his body relaxed, his mind racing. Every moment he spent here, he was learning, planning, waiting. They thought he was just a harmless pet, a strange, weak creature from a backwater planet. But they had no idea. He wasn't just going to escape. He was going to take something valuable with him. The silent observer. The royal chamber was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Massive golden pillars stretched toward the high ceiling, shimmering under floating crystal lights. The furniture was sleek, alien, yet strangely luxurious. Silken drapes, walls made of some metallic material that changed colors depending on where he looked, and a massive holographic window showing the vastness of space. The Empress's private world was a kingdom floating in the stars, and he was trapped inside it. Jake kept his posture loose as he sat on the floor near a small pedestal where a golden dish held fresh, strange-looking fruit. He had been given food, comfort, and even a soft sleeping mat. To any observer, he looked completely at ease. But inside, he was memorizing every detail. Where the guards stood, where the control panels were, how the doors opened and closed, what the Empress said and how she acted. The more he learned, the better his chances of escaping. The Empress watches. Empress Calvera sat in her massive chair, her silver eyes scanning over a glowing screen filled with data. She barely acknowledged Jake, but he could tell she was watching him in the corner of her vision. She was testing him, waiting for him to do something unexpected. Jake stayed still, keeping up his act. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke without looking at him. "Tell me, little creature." Her voice was soft, but the power behind it was undeniable. "What is it like to be so simple?" Jake didn't react. He kept his expression blank. "Do you even think?" She mused, tilting her head. "Do you feel anything beyond hunger and fear?" Jake blinked slowly, pretending to process her words as if they were just strange sounds. The Empress smirked. "Perhaps you are just a mindless thing after all," she murmured. She turned back to her screen, no longer interested in him. But that was exactly what Jake wanted. A key discovery. Later that night, the guards escorted Jake to a private resting area within the royal quarters. It was a small, enclosed space with a comfortable floor mat and soft lighting. As soon as the doors sealed shut, Jake's relaxed posture vanished. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. He had spent the entire day listening and observing, and now he had the beginnings of a plan. The first thing he had learned: the palace was filled with hidden technology. During his time in the royal chamber, he had noticed a small, almost invisible panel built into the side of the wall. Every time the Empress used it, holographic screens would appear, giving her full control over the palace security, ship communications, and even weapons systems. Jake had seen her disable and enable the palace shields with a single press of a glowing symbol. That was his way out. If he could access that panel, he could disable the security systems, open the gates, and send out a distress signal. But the biggest problem was, how would he get close to it without looking suspicious? Stealing a tool. Jake lay on the soft mat, pretending to be asleep. But his ears were alert, listening to every sound outside his chamber. After an hour, he heard footsteps approaching. A single guard entered, carrying a small metal tray with food. Jake barely opened his eyes, watching as the guard placed the tray down and tapped a control on his wristband. As the door began to slide shut, Jake made his move. He lunged forward, swiping a small metallic device from the guard's belt just as the door closed. The moment the guard left, Jake sat up, turning the device over in his hands. It was a miniature control tablet, a basic interface that guards used to communicate with each other. It wasn't much, but it was a start. If he could hack into the system, even in a small way, he might be able to learn more about the palace's security network. His escape plan had officially begun. The Empress grows suspicious. The next morning, Jake was returned to the royal chamber, where the Empress sat on her throne, her expression unreadable. But this time, something was different. Her eyes studied him more closely. "You are very obedient," she said slowly. Jake remained still, pretending not to understand. She smirked, leaning forward. "Yet there is something about you, something I cannot quite place." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. She was starting to notice things. "I have to move faster," Jake thought. The longer he stayed, the more dangerous this game became. But he had already started his first step toward freedom. Now, he just needed a way to break into the control systems before the Empress figured out the truth. The Empress grows suspicious. Jake Carter had always been good at keeping his cool. Back on Earth, he had survived fights, scams, and bad decisions by staying calm and thinking fast. But now, as he sat on the smooth, polished floor of the Empress's chamber, he felt something he hadn't before. Her eyes were on him, studying him, testing him. And that was dangerous. The silent game. The golden throne room was quiet except for the occasional humming of alien technology and the soft rustling of the Empress's robe as she shifted. Jake sat on his usual spot, on the floor near the ornamental pedestal, pretending to be the simple, mindless creature they all believed him to be. But today felt different. The Empress, Queen Salvera, was not looking at her screens. She was not giving orders to her generals. She was watching him. Her silver eyes held something new: suspicion, curiosity. She had begun to notice things. Jake had been too careful, too obedient. Any real pet, any real animal, would have shown fear, frustration, resistance by now. But Jake had been too controlled, too patient. And the Empress had sensed it. The first test. After a long silence, the Empress rose from her throne. Her black and gold robe flowed around her, giving her an aura of deadly grace. Jake kept his head slightly tilted, feigning dull confusion, just like an animal would. She took slow steps toward him, her gaze piercing. Then she did something unexpected. She dropped a small metallic object, a golden ring-shaped device, right in front of him. Jake's body stiffened slightly before he caught himself. She was watching for a reaction. His instincts screamed at him, "Don't pick it up. Don't show interest. Don't give her anything." He stared at it blankly. The Empress smiled. She stepped on the ring, making it roll across the floor. It stopped a few feet away. Jake kept his eyes on her, pretending not to care about the object at all. She let out a soft chuckle. Interesting. She was testing his intelligence. A real pet would have chased the object. A real pet would have been curious. Jake had just failed that test. Damn it. The Empress slowly walked around him now, circling him like a predator. "You are too calm," she murmured. Jake fought every instinct to remain still, to keep his breathing even. "Most creatures in my palace take days to adjust. They cry. They shake in fear. Some even try to escape." Her voice was soft, almost amused, but there was a dangerous edge beneath it. "But you sit there like you understand everything around you." Jake didn't move, didn't blink. Then she crouched down in front of him. He could feel her gaze piercing into him, feel the weight of her curiosity pressing against his skin. Then suddenly, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Jake stiffened, but only for a fraction of a second. Too late. She had felt it. Her silver eyes narrowed. That was a very human reaction. Jake forced his body to relax, pretending to be confused by her touch. He tilted his head slightly, as if his mind couldn't process what was happening. But inside, his thoughts were racing. She suspects me. A deadly game begins. The Empress slowly released his wrist and stood back up. She wasn't fully convinced yet, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Then she turned and spoke to her guards. "Prepare a mind scan." Jake's blood ran cold. A mind scan. That could mean anything. But if it was what he thought, if they had a way to read his thoughts, detect his intelligence, his entire plan would be ruined. He had to act fast. "Your Majesty," a guard hesitated. "Our scan equipment was recently damaged. It will take time to repair." The Empress frowned. "How long?" "2 days, Empress." Jake silently exhaled. 2 days. That was all the time he had left before they exposed him completely. 2 days to escape. The secret passage. Later that night, Jake was placed back in his private chamber, his so-called resting area within the palace. But he knew now he had to move immediately. As soon as the guards were gone, he took out the stolen guard's device he had swiped earlier. He tapped on it, scrolling through the strange alien symbols. He didn't fully understand the language, but he had been observing their interface closely. After several attempts, he unlocked a map of the palace. And there it was, a hidden passage. A forgotten ventilation tunnel that led directly to the Empress's personal control room. The same room that had the security panel he needed to access. Jake clenched his fists. This was his chance. If he could get in there, he could disable the palace shields and send a distress signal to any nearby ships. Maybe even steal one of the escape pods. But there was one problem. He had to get past the guards first. A risky move. The next morning, Jake made his first calculated risk. Instead of sitting silently in the royal chamber, he did something different. He acted playful, curious. He imitated what a pet should act like. He pushed objects with his hands, made small sounds, even tried to mimic their alien way of sitting. The guards laughed. The Empress watched in silence. She was still suspicious, but now she was questioning herself. "Perhaps I was mistaken," she murmured. "Perhaps you really are just a mindless thing after all." Jake kept his smirk hidden. He had bought himself more time. That night, when the palace grew quiet, Jake made his move. He slipped through the hidden passage, his heart pounding. Each step he took was dangerous. If he was caught, he would be executed immediately. But he had no choice, because in just a few hours, they would try to scan his mind. And when they did, they would learn the truth. The desperate gamble. Jake Carter moved silently through the hidden passage, his heart pounding like a war drum. He was inside the walls of the Empress's palace, crawling through a dark, narrow ventilation tunnel. The metal beneath his hands was cold, and every movement sent a faint echo through the passage. This was it, his one shot at freedom. If he failed, if he was caught, there would be no second chance. A deadly countdown. Jake had less than a day before the Empress's scientists repaired the mind scan machine. Once that happened, his cover would be blown. They would see his intelligence, his thoughts, everything. He would no longer be a harmless pet. He would be a threat to the Empire. And threats didn't get cages. They got executed. That meant one thing. He had to act now. His objective was simple but almost impossible. Break into the Empress's control room. Disable the palace's shields and security systems. Send out a distress signal. Escape before anyone realized what was happening. But he wasn't just trying to escape anymore. He was going to take something with him. The control room heist. After crawling through the passage for what felt like an eternity, Jake finally reached his destination. A small metallic grate blocked his path. Beyond it, he could see the control room, glowing with holographic displays and flickering screens. This was the brain of the palace. If he could access the main console, he could override security, open the gates, and call for help. Jake took a deep breath and reached for the grate. He carefully unhooked the screws, moving as slowly as possible. Then, click, the grate came free. Jake lowered himself down into the room, his feet landing lightly on the smooth floor. For a moment, he didn't move. He listened. Silence. The guards weren't here. This was his chance. Moving quickly, he rushed toward the central control panel. The screen flickered with strange alien symbols, but after days of watching the Empress, he had learned enough. Jake's fingers flew over the interface. Disable palace shields. Done. Deactivate security cameras. Done. Unlock gates to the escape hangar. Done. Everything was working. He was almost free. Then, a soft, cold voice spoke behind him. Clever little creature. Jake froze. The Empress's trap. He turned around slowly. Standing in the doorway, wearing a long black robe with golden symbols glowing along the edges, was Empress Calvera herself. Her silver eyes shimmered with amusement and danger. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. How? She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in her throne room, preparing for the mind scan. Had she expected this? The Empress stepped forward, her sharp heels clicking against the floor. I knew there was something different about you, she said softly. She glanced at the control panel behind him, where the disabled security systems were still displayed on the screen. And now, you've proven it. Jake's mind raced. He needed a plan. Fast. Outsmarting a queen. He forced himself to breathe normally, keeping his face calm. Pet, he said, tilting his head like a confused animal. It was a gamble. One last attempt to fool her. For a moment, the Empress said nothing. Then she laughed. Oh, I do admire your dedication to the act, human. Jake's stomach dropped. She had called him human. The game was over. She knew. Did you truly believe you could outsmart me? She continued, stepping closer. That you could slip past my guards, break into my control room, and leave my palace, without me noticing. Jake clenched his jaw. He had one chance left. He took a step back, pressing his hand against the control panel behind him. And then, he hit the emergency override. Everything falls apart. Alarm activated. A deafening siren exploded through the palace. The emergency red lights flashed wildly, casting strange shadows against the walls. Jake didn't wait. He lunged toward the doorway, trying to escape before the Empress could react. But she was faster. With inhuman speed, she caught his wrist, her grip like iron. Jake twisted, trying to break free, but her strength was unreal. No, 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 she whispered. You don't get to run, little human. Then she slammed her free hand against his chest. Jake felt a sharp electric pain explode through his body. Darkness rushed in. Captured again. When Jake woke up, his entire body ached. He was back in a cage. But this time, it was different. This wasn't the comfortable palace room where they had kept him before. This was a prison cell, cold, metallic, reinforced with energy bars that hummed with deadly power. He wasn't a pet anymore. He was a prisoner. Footsteps echoed outside his cage. The Empress appeared, standing on the other side of the energy barrier. That was impressive, she admitted, folding her arms. No other creature in my palace has ever gotten that far. Jake stayed silent. She tilted her head. Tell me, human, what should I do with you now? Jake met her gaze. And then, despite everything, despite the pain, despite his failure, he smirked. Whatever you want, he said, but you'll never keep me locked up forever. The Empress's silver eyes glowed. And she smiled back, as if the real game had just begun. Turning the tables, Jake Carter sat in his cold, metallic prison cell, his back against the wall, arms resting on his knees. His body still ached from the Empress's attack, but his mind was sharper than ever. She thought she had won. She thought she had him under control. But she was wrong. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. A dangerous curiosity. Outside the energy cage, Empress Caxalvera stood watching him. Her silver eyes gleamed with something strange, amusement, fascination, and something else. "You know it," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "I should have had you executed the moment I realized what you were." Jake didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly, keeping his expression unreadable. "And yet," she continued, "I cannot bring myself to do it." She took a slow step forward, studying him like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "You are unlike any other creature I have captured. You do not cry. You do not beg. Even now, after losing, you sit there, waiting." She narrowed her eyes. "You are still planning something, aren't you?" Jake smirked. That was the problem with smart rulers. They knew when something was off. "I'm just a pet," he said, mocking her own words from before. The Empress let out a soft laugh. "No, you are not." She stepped closer, her tall frame casting a shadow over him. "Tell me, human, what is your true purpose? Why did you not beg for freedom? Why did you not plead for mercy?" Jake met her gaze, his smirk widening. "Because I don't need to beg. I'm getting out of here, one way or another." The Empress's smile faded slightly. For the first time, Jake saw something flicker in her expression. Uncertainty. A sliver of doubt. She turned sharply. "Prepare him for interrogation," she ordered the guards. Jake's smirk didn't waver. She was playing his game now. An unexpected offer. Jake expected torture. He expected pain, tricks, psychological warfare. But what he didn't expect was dinner. Hours later, he was escorted to a lavish dining hall. A massive room filled with floating crystal lights, golden pillars, and a massive glass table covered in alien food. And at the head of the table sat Empress Xalvera herself. The guards pushed Jake forward, forcing him into a seat directly across from her. "Eat," she said simply, gesturing to the food. Jake glanced at the meal. Various strange fruits, steaming meats, and glowing liquids. "What is this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "A conversation," the Empress replied, picking up a silver goblet. "If I wanted you dead, you would be dead already." Jake hesitated. Was this a trick? Poison? A way to make him lower his guard? The Empress smirked. "You think I would waste poison on you," she said, reading his thoughts. "If I wanted to break you, I would have let my scientists tear your mind apart." Jake studied her carefully. He didn't trust her, but this was an opportunity. He picked up a piece of fruit and took a slow, cautious bite. It was surprisingly sweet, juicy, like mango mixed with something he couldn't quite name. The Empress watched him, clearly amused. "Tell me, Jake Carter," she said, resting her chin on her hand, "why do you fight so hard?" Jake leaned back, chewing slowly. "Because you put me in a cage," he said simply. The Empress chuckled. "Ah, but some creatures grow to love their cages," she mused. "Safety, comfort, no struggle, no war, no pain." Jake shook his head. "Then you don't understand humans." The Empress raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me, what drives your kind? What makes humans so different?" Jake took a slow sip from a crystal goblet, letting the silence stretch. Then he set it down and leaned forward. "We don't stop," he said. "We fight. We adapt. We survive." He locked eyes with her. "You think I'm special, but I'm not. Any human in my place would be doing the same thing." The Empress was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled. "I do like you, Jake Carter." She stood, her robe flowing behind her like a dark wave. "Very well. You have convinced me." Jake's pulse quickened. What was she about to do? "I will not execute you," she said. "Instead, I will keep you." Jake's blood ran cold. "What?" The Empress turned, looking over her shoulder. "I could use someone like you." Her silver eyes glowed. "You are clever, unpredictable, and dangerous. I would rather have you at my side than against me." Jake's jaw tightened. "You're offering me what? A job?" She smirked. "More than a job. A place at my court. A position of power." She leaned closer. "I am offering you a future, Jake Carter. A place where you will never be caged again." Jake's heart pounded. This was new. This was unexpected. Was she serious? Or was this just another game? The choice. Jake had two options. Accept her offer, become part of her empire, gain access to power, and wait for the right moment to strike. Refuse her offer, and risk being locked up again, or worse. Both paths were dangerous. Both paths required careful thinking. Jake leaned back, exhaling slowly. Then he looked at the Empress and smiled. "Tell me more." The Empress's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Good," she murmured. "Very good." But in the back of Jake's mind, one thought remained. No matter what happened, he was still going to escape. Because no human belongs in a cage. The Great Escape and the Final Twist. Jake Carter sat in the royal chamber, his mind sharper than ever. The Empress had made her move. She had offered him power, a place at her side. She thought she had won. That he would break. That he would serve. But she didn't understand humans. Jake wasn't a pet. And he sure as hell wasn't going to become her pawn. The long game begins. For the past 3 days, Jake had played the perfect role. He acted interested in the Empress's offer. He asked questions, learned more about her empire, and pretended to be grateful for her mercy. And all the while, he studied her palace, her security systems, and her weaknesses. Everything had led to this moment. Now, as he stood before the Empress's grand throne, he knew it was time. A dangerous betrayal. "You seem more at ease, human," the Empress said, swirling a golden drink in her hand. Jake smirked. "I'm adapting." She chuckled. "Good. I knew you would see reason." She gestured toward a holographic map of the galaxy, its glowing red dots marking the Empress's war fleets, hidden bases, and planetary strongholds. "This could be yours one day," she mused. "A world of power, far beyond what your little human mind has ever imagined." Jake tilted his head, feigning interest. But inside, he was counting down the seconds. The escape plan. Jake had everything in place. Stolen access codes, lifted from one of the high-ranking guards. A hacked transmission device, set to send a distress signal to any nearby enemies of the Empire. An escape pod prepped and ready, hidden in the maintenance bay, where no one would check. All he had to do was trigger the plan. And the moment came faster than expected. The perfect distraction. Just as the Empress lifted her drink, a loud explosion rocked the palace. The walls shook, alarms blared, and the room flashed red. "What?" The Empress stood, eyes narrowing. Jake grinned. He had set off an overload in the security grid, forcing a palace-wide lockdown. Chaos. Confusion. His perfect chance. The guards rushed forward, but Jake moved first. He snatched a blade from one of their belts, twisting the guard's arm and knocking him to the ground. In one swift motion, he grabbed the guard's pulse gun and aimed it directly at the throne. The Empress didn't move. She smirked. "Finally," she whispered, "you stop pretending." Jake pulled the trigger. The battle for freedom. The pulse blast hit the throne's shield barrier, sending a wave of energy through the air. Jake sprinted toward the exit, dodging the guards who lunged for him. One grabbed his arm. Jake twisted, slammed an elbow into the alien's throat, and kept running. The palace halls were in chaos. Jake's distress signal had done its job. Enemy warships had arrived, attacking the Empress's fleet. The sky outside the massive windows was filled with fire and destruction. Perfect. He made it to the maintenance bay, where the escape pod was waiting. Just a few more steps. Then, a cold voice stopped him. Going somewhere, human. Jake froze. The Empress stood in front of the pod, completely calm, despite the chaos around them. You surprised me again, she said. You played the game well. But tell me, do you really think you can run from me? Jake clenched his jaw. I don't run. I survive. And with that, he lunged forward. The final confrontation. Jake dodged the Empress's first strike, a sharp, fast movement meant to disable him instantly. She was stronger, faster, but Jake was smarter. He used her own momentum against her, twisting under her arm and grabbing a plasma charge from the supply rack. With a swift movement, he activated it and slammed it against the control panel behind her. The doors to the escape pod hissed open. The Empress's eyes flickered with realization. For the first time, she had been outplayed. Jake grinned. Checkmate. And then he dived into the pod and launched it. Escape, or a new hunt. The escape pod shot through the chaos of battle, spiraling away from the burning palace. Jake's heart raced. He had won. He was free. But then, a quiet beeping sound caught his attention. Jake looked down at his wrist. A tiny, blinking red light was embedded just under his skin. A tracker. His stomach dropped. The Empress had known. She had let him go. Not because he had escaped, because the hunt had just begun. Final twist. The Empress's message. As Jake drifted through space, the pod's holographic screen flickered to life. The Empress's face appeared, calm, unreadable. Well played, Jake Carter, she said softly. You've won this round. Her silver eyes glowed. But this is far from over. The transmission cut out. Jake sat back, breathing heavily. Then, despite everything, he laughed. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far bigger. And for the first time, he was ready for it.